consequences of not starting the job earlier in the day and believing the weather forecast, which said it was going to be mainly cloudy with a bit of sun. Well, the weather forecast seems to be back to front, because I think there's going to be more sun than cloud. Consequences are it's warming up in here. I can't leave the fans off because it'll just get too hot. And don't forget, I'm working in here as well. So this is now not a comfortable thing to be doing, is watering now, because both the fans are on. Whoops, forgot that one. They're now both on. They should have been on anyway, and all the foggers are on the go because the extractor fan's on. So I've now got to work in this environment with the fans blowing me hair all over the place, and watching where I put the plants, because the fans are actually on and turning around where I put the plants. And it's getting hot in here, which makes it a little bit uncomfortable. See, if I'd got on with the job earlier in the day, I wouldn't have this problem, because I'd be halfway round now instead of, well, not long starting. Sometimes it pays to get up and get at it. Well, I was up, but I didn't get at it. Okay, let's have a think about some mounted orchids and the different types that I've got and the effect of watering and feeding. Now, this one is in trouble. One of two reasons. You see, it's all started to grow some nice new roots. Nearly all of the root tips have gone, apart from one, maybe two or three. The one sticking out here, away from the moss, has got a lovely green growing tip. The ones that have tried to go down into the moss, not so good. One of two reasons. One, it's been on that mount a long time. That moss has had it. So from that point of view, it needs to come off. Number two, we could have a muncher living in there. I'm not immune to those tiny little snails, and one of the worst places they can get is in behind the moss on the mount, because anything that comes near them, they will chew the ends off. So that needs to come off of its mount. But unfortunately, because of the type of orchid it is, I don't want it bare rooted. And I haven't got any moss at the moment, so it's going to have to wait a bit. I'll have to live with it. And again, if a few root ends have been chewed off, they'll branch. They'll be fine. They'll push on. If it's the moss that's breaking down that's spoiling them, again, once that moss is taken away and the base of the plant's cleaned up nicely and it gets some fresh moss, they'll grow away again. But it's a bit late in the season to be mucking about with this, Roger. So why is it so late in the season? Because it's only recently started producing its new root system. It's as simple as that. Otherwise this would have been done much earlier in the year. But that's one I need to get at. So old breaking down moss. What's happening in that mount then? Well, that got fed yesterday. So at the level it got fed, what would it have got? Well, at the time of watering, because of the way I water, anything that was lurking around in that moss from any times before should have got washed out pretty well. I won't say totally, because that is virtually impossible, but it would have been flushed at the same time. So the old stuff would have been replaced by the new stuff. And the new stuff was at a low feed level. So the pH of the new moisture, the new hydration, would have been around that 6.2, maybe 6.3. So one of the elements we keep talking about would have been readily available. But given how old that moss is, and how acidic it probably is, probably in 24 hours the hydration in that moss would have changed the pH and lowered it. It could be that quick. Yeah? And as a consequence, later in the day or overnight, it would have got the other one, because the pH would have dropped down. Yeah? So that could have had a balanced feed, but sitting on that old moss is not doing any good. That's like a different subject, really. I'm just discussing what goes on. Right, let's have a look at this one then. What was that one? I've forgotten. That was Findlayanum or Friedrichianum? Friedrichianum. That one. And it's a good plant. It's pushed on some smashing new growth this year. Doing well. Love it. And this is my Nesta, which is an anosmum cross. No, it's not. It's actually an osman. Nesta's still up there lurking. They look identical, apart from the fact this one's got 3 growths and this one's only got 1. But lovely new growth, lovely new root system. Was got earlier this year, therefore the moss it's on is quite new. Therefore wouldn't turn acidic very quickly. And given that it's a mount, even in duller weather, it dries within 24 hours. Yeah? So depending on that, depends on whether I water it every day or every other day. That's my only decision. Yeah? Those that are in moss, did we get a dull day where the temperatures didn't climb? If so, it can wait a day. Make sure it dries properly. Okay? Where are most of the roots? They're attached to the bark. Now that's cork bark, which is deemed pretty inert. Yeah? So those bare roots don't get much of a change relative to pH, mainly because that cork, you can't wet the flipping stuff. That's why it floats. It doesn't hold any water. So, you know, obviously when I pour the water all over that one, those roots get what they get at that point. What they don't use is possibly still on the roots. But then I don't feed frequently, so there wouldn't be a build-up. The chances are 2 feeds and a flush. But what won't this one be getting? If that is pretty basic and has got very little if any acidity in it because it's new, then this one had a pH well above 5.8 because of the low level feed, and it would have got the magnesium. Will it get its calcium? Unlikely on that one, whereas that one would. Now you see the difference I'm trying to get at. That's why it's, for me, it's at individual plant level, what I plan for the future, but I'll set them up in sets. So there'll be sets of plants. There'll be those that are okay. Now that's not okay because of the breaking down moss, but it's okay as far as its feed's concerned. This one isn't. So this one needs to be treated differently. This one needs to get the low level of feed, normal on one day, the next day or the day after, depending on the heat, it will get the other type of low level feed with the additive to lower the pH so that it can get the other element of the 2. All the other elements are generally available. It's just these 2. And this swapping, one high, one low, just makes so much sense to me. And then over the period of time, the plant is getting a balance. It's just not getting it all at once. But that's fine. The plant will sort itself out. Yeah? So that's the difference between the types of mounts. I've still got one other type of mount yet. We'll get there in a minute. Okay, here's another type of mount. I know it doesn't look much like a mount, but it is. In principle, it's a bare-rooted plant. This one's a little Vander, young plant growing on, and it's effectively bare-rooted. Now, up until the beginning of this year, that basket was absolutely full of moss, and basically I hooked it all out. Well, there's a couple of tiny little bits left in there, because I wanted it bare-rooted, which is now what it is. Now let's have a think about what's happening to that one. Well, first thing that's going to happen is that. And because it's a wooden basket, it floats. But I have a devious way of getting it to sink, and that's putting it in the bucket at the same time as this one. Now this one I have to thread the roots in carefully, which with 2 hands would be a lot easier. But once I get that plant in there as well, it tends to hold that one down under the water. There we go. Now they're both in the water. Now what's happening now then? The level of feed in here is higher than what the other plants get. Not hugely high, not ridiculous, but I usually start that off at about a TDS reading of about 320, and I'm relatively confident, although I haven't tested it, that the pH for that would be down below the 5.8. Yeah? So these plants are probably getting their calcium okay, but they're probably not getting their magnesium. Yeah? So these are the other way round. And that's going to apply to anything that goes in that bucket, which is basically the Vanders. Occasionally some other things get dropped in there just because I want to leave them to soak for a while, but it's mainly the Vanders that go in there. So the Vanders may well be short of magnesium, and that's important, yeah? So I may need to adjust the way that I feed my Vanders. It's difficult because I reuse that water in the bucket for a while. It's an unpredictable time, but basically the warmer the weather, the faster I run out of RO water, because I'm feeding the foggers with the flipping stuff, so I run out quite quickly. And every time the RO unit goes on, that water gets replaced. So I would say a maximum of a week. And they should get watered every day, irrespective of the weather and the temperatures, but I don't. Basically, when they go in there, they get a good soak. And then if that's a dull day and the following day is a dull day, I'll probably miss a day and they'll get done again the next day. So they probably get watered maybe 3, maybe 4, occasionally 5 times before the water's changed. But the fertilizer I'm using should remain reasonably stable for a while, so there shouldn't be any major changes going on in there. Well, that's what I'm told. It's incredibly difficult to prove one way or the other. So you just have to believe the manufacturer, you know. So yeah, so that's what I do with the Vanders. But again, they're bare rooted, so the only feed content that those roots get is at the point they're in that bucket, and from the point I take them out, they start to dry, and the speed of drying is totally dependent on temperature and air circulation. Well, my air circulation's good. It's currently trying to take my wig off because it's warm in here. Yeah, so the air is constantly moving. Those go off later in the evening. So you'd think, oh, that's still air in the lower temperatures. No, it's not. There's 4 of those little things lurking around that move the air very, very gently 24/7. So I'm not totally dependent on these 2 and the bigger ones. Yeah, so there's always some air movement in here, even in the depths of winter. So that's another type of mount, and what I'm doing with those needs to change. Okay, and now my pH meter's here. I can deal with that, but for today they're getting what they're getting because I've got everything to do today and I haven't got time to mess about or the inkling to mess about. So today everything stays as it is. All the pots are getting a flush, and all what I call my dailies, the mounted orchids, are getting a flush except for them. They're getting what's in the bucket. Now things change in that bucket, it doesn't stay the same. If I water all my Vanders, the level in that bucket goes down 1 inch. That's how much water they take out of the bucket. And given there's not that many of them, they're taking quite a bit out. So I start off with a TDS reading of around 320, between 300 and 330. That's what I aim at. It doesn't need to be exact. Somewhere near there will do. But then what happens? I feed my Vanders, hang them up to dry, and when I come back the next day to do it, the level in the bucket's down. So I pour some more pure water in there. What does that do? That reduces the TDS reading. And then I'll do it again, and it reduces it again. So maybe I'm okay. As long as there's no changes in the chemical structure going on in that bucket, which I'm told there shouldn't be, then over a week, by diluting it every time I use it, by the time I get to the end of the week, I'm down probably to around the 200 mark with an equivalent rise in pH. Now that needs to be proven and tested, which I can't do today, but I'll work on that because that might be okay. But I can't supply enough RO water to change that water every time I use it. I can't do it, so that's not changing. Irrespective of what anybody says, that's not changing. These Vanders have been living like this, dunking in the bucket for 3 years. They're doing okay. So I'm not changing anything with the Vanders, I'm just thinking out loud at the moment, and it may be that with a check, if I check my pH at the start, when it's fresh water with new feed at about 320 and get a pH reading, and then towards the end of the use of that water and the dilution that's taken place, I'll check it again. And if the pH is down where I want it towards the end, then these are getting the balanced feed over that period of time. If not, I'll fiddle with it. So that's yet another type of mount. This is a mount that's bare rooted that gets dunked, and that really only relates to the Vanders, so they're a special case. They drink a lot, basically. That's what it comes down to. And the recommendation from Dr. Moat from sunny Florida, which is a whole different ball game, growing outside and all that sort of stuff, is that you thoroughly hydrate your roots until they go as dark a green as they're ever going to go, and then they're fully hydrated. With your feed or without, that's irrelevant. It's just the watering methodology. And then you wait 12 to 24 hours and you do it again. Time of year, temperature, weather, doesn't matter. That's what you do. But I have to qualify that statement and say that's what you do in Florida. It might not be totally applicable in the UK. So I'm certainly not doing that all through the winter when the temperatures are right down, because they won't use that moisture and they won't use that feed because they're going to slow up. Yeah, so I do have to adjust according to where I live. Now here we have another type of mount. It's actually mounted. So yes, it may be similar to the way the Vanders are looked after, but it's not the same, because this one gets water poured all over the roots. So it gets the sort of water that, you know, the dailies are getting at the time. Now this was a plant I nearly lost. This is excuse me, Rhyncholalia glauca, the notorious non-bloomer, and it was in a hell of a state. Some rock got in the base and I had to hack it to pieces and try and find some pieces that would grow. And when I strapped them onto that mount, there was virtually no roots, or no viable ones. That's the remnants there of the root system I had, those couple of manky looking things there. Since then it's done its thing with the roots. It's attaching, it's doing well, but it is two separate bits of plant there. Now the top section is the larger section, and that's the one that chucked the roots out like they were going out of fashion, but no sign of new growths. But there is a sign of new growth now. Against the latest growth, there are some signs of eyes starting to move, and I should flipping think so with a root system like that. Come on. Now the other little piece I didn't even think would live, now that decided to push out two new growths round the back, squashed up against the mount because it's tied on, and no new roots. But now it's growing roots, so that's got growths and roots. So the plant is going to recover, but it's easily hydrated. But look at the state of the leaves. What colour are they? Are they a nice deep green like they should be? No, they're not. They've got pale coloration and signs of some desiccation. Now you have to bear in mind they were slightly desiccated when I mounted them, and some leaf types, once they go, they'll never plump up. Yeah? But that discoloration, I would say, is almost certainly a nutrient deficiency. And by now you should all be able to put your hands up and say what's missing from this plant just by what it's been getting. It's been getting a low level feed along with the other dailies, so that would have a pH again around that 6.2, 6.3 ish. So it's been getting one of those important lower elements and not the other one. So I can quite safely say that plant is suffering from calcium deficiency. And that might be why it's slow and reluctant to push on those new growths. Yes, it's done the roots, but it hasn't done the growths yet. So my little change to the way I work, there's a classic example of like a benchmark. Let's see what the change does to that plant. I'm going to revisit this plant over the next month or two before the growing season ends. We'll see what changes happen as a result of messing with the pH. A good one. I hadn't thought of this until I picked it up and looked at it closer. So we'll see what happens with that one. I'll be incredibly interested. You might be as well. Now this is the last one I'm going to look at. I think of these plants in the holy clay pots like I do my mounted orchids with a bit of moss, because that's how they're working. Several reasons here. First of all, they're all in chunky bark, so there's an awful lot of air in round underneath that plant, and as opposed to a normal clay pot, there's an awful lot more air in round that root area. Yeah, so they're on an incredibly fast wet dry cycle, aided and abetted by the fact it's a clay pot. Now this clay is hard. I did some experiments when I first got the pots, and actually tried getting an exact level of water and a bone dry pot, and then soaking the pot in that water for 24 hours to see if it went down any. In other words, how much water went into the pot, and it was negligible. They're very hard, so they don't hold an awful lot of water, but what they do is suck the moisture out of any bark that's close to them and aid the wet dry cycle. Now if you've got soft clay, it can take moisture away at such a rate that it can mess your roots up. Yeah, it'll even suck the moisture out of the roots that are touching the clay. Now I haven't seen that problem with this clay yet, but I do know people that have had that problem, some very well known people. Anyway, so that's another kettle of fish. Now what changes would be going on in that pot after watering? Let's have a think. I've just watered it, say, with some feed. Now we all know the pH would be, I'm not saying it again, I'm getting bored. But because of the low level of feed, it would have had the pH above the 5.8 mark. So magnesium should be readily available. But then what's going to happen? Whatever moisture is available to that plant is gone rapid fast, just like a bare rooted plant. In fact, it's almost as quick. Yeah? So you end up with no moisture left at all. So any residual feed is still there, but in a dry form. So it's not available to the plant. Yeah? And if I kept doing that over and over again, what would happen in that pot? Well, that residual feed could start to build up, and that's not going to do the roots that are down in the pot any good at all. That's why we flush, to wash the flipping stuff out that hasn't been used and start again with known stuff. That's all it's for. Shift out all the old stuff that hasn't been used, give it a good wash off, and then start again with some fresh feed that you've mixed up and you know what's in it. But what that plant won't have been getting is probably calcium. Very little, if any. That looks like nutrient deficiency to me, yet again. Maybe not gone too far on this one. Those are the oldest leaves, mind. I nearly lost this plant. I mean, this plant's future is those two nice new growths pushing on, and its new root system that it's getting going with. So those are older leaves, but nonetheless, nutrient deficiency shows cumulatively on some leaves. Sometimes it shows fast, and then it just stays there, and sometimes it gets worse, and sometimes it takes quite a long time to show, and it's very slow to show. So it's a gradual change, and those are the hardest to see, the gradual changes. So this may be as a result of old management bringing it forward to current management, but that's my goal, is to make sure those new growths get fed properly while they're that size. Let's get them going and get some strong new clean leaves with a balanced feed, which, okay, is going to have to mean an alternation of methodologies, but that's what it's got to be. Excuse me. Right, okay, that'll do for this one. that's the various types of environments that my plants live in. There's all sorts, yeah? You know, there's some that are half bare rooted and half in moss. That's relatively fresh moss, and there's not much of it. And then there's some like that. That's relatively fresh moss, but there's a lot of it, yeah? So there's variables. I mean, this thing has been on this mount for ages, and it only ever had a tiny little bit of moss, so whatever moss it had has probably disintegrated. But I'm not taking it off that mount, because nearly all the new growth is round the edge of where the moss was, and the older part of the plant in the centre has died off. That's how that type of dendrobium grows. The new growths push out in all directions, and any roots that come off of those new growths, as you can see, most of them are either clambering all over the older part of the plant or burying themselves onto the bare mount. So that's not coming off that mount, it's staying where it is, and it can totally engross that mount if it wants to. It's chucked out a lot of new growths this year. I'm happy with it, even though buried in under the centre of that plant is some moss that has broken down. But it's not that relevant to the new parts of the plant because they've moved away from it, so it's doing okay. So yeah, another type of mount. Anyway, that's that's it for this one. I hate messing about in here when the fans are on. I was holding a plant just now and I heard that horrible sound like brrr, and that was basically a new growth. So it's now only half a new growth. Luckily it was on a plant that had loads. So anyway, thanks for hanging in there with this one. Not all resolved, but plans in place. That's all I can do at this stage. And obviously the changes are a gradual process, so they will happen over time. I'm in the middle of the better end of the growing season, shall we say, but you know, we're already down to we've gone from just under 16 and a half hours to 14 and a half. By the end of this month, what's that, just over 2 weeks, we're going to be down to 13 and a half, yeah? And by the end of next month we'll be down to less than 12, and by the end of October the day lengths are so short I would class the growing season as tailing off dramatically, and at that point it's all changing here. Things won't be growing as quick, things won't be using as much water or needing as much feed as a consequence, so it will be all change again. But that's at least 2 months away. Let's not write the growing season off while we're still in the middle of it. And while we're in the middle of it and things are actively growing, feed and water well. Just make sure you know what you're doing with your feed and don't just dump any old thing on your plants. You know, let's have a think about it. And bottom line, always stand back and think, how much feed do wild orchids get? And the answer is next to none. Do they do okay? Well, yes and no. They live, they survive, they bloom, they produce seed, and they perpetuate their species. But if you have a look at some of the wild plants, boy are they in a state. They've been bashed around by the wind, they've had animals take bites out of them, and birds have pecked the blooms off, and all sorts of things. They do get in quite a sorry state, because they're not in nice controlled environments like what we've got. But they live, survive, and perpetuate their species with very little feed. They do okay. Now we'd like to think we can do a little bit better, but sometimes you can be too much of a smart ass and overcook things. So don't feed your orchids really high levels. You won't do them any good, and you just well pour that fertilizer down the sink. You're just wasting it, because they won't use it. And what they don't use hangs around, and by hanging around it builds up and perpetuates a downward spiral. So look after yourselves, happy growing, and don't take it all too seriously. And again, another bottom line I often remind people of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But always step back and think, that plant's doing okay, great. Could it be doing any better? And if the answer is yes, then just try and think of a way of making it a bit better. Yeah, that's all we can do. We do what we can. See you again. Thanks for visiting my channel. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, there are some others you could watch below. You can just click on the thumbnails. If you'd like to see more of my videos, please subscribe to my channel. You can use the link below. I post on most days, so hope to see you again soon. Thanks for stopping by.